Welcome to part 2 of the 2-1 review video. What I'd like to say here for the second half is I'm just going to try to hit the big ideas. I think this reading is easy in that it's very, very repetitive. The ideas don't come fast and furious, but rather there's many variations of similar ideas. And so what we'll focus on is critiquing naturalization, which is what this chapter or these chapters are all about eventually, especially when you get to what is chapter 1 of the book and focuses on that. So here's what we need to know. The definitions and the binaries that represent, humans versus nature or civilization versus the natural that we can apply to the environment, we can apply them to people as well. And that usually doesn't go so well, okay? What does that mean? It blurs the merging of the two, blurs other possibilities, wipes them out from our thinking, can naturalize things that aren't actually very good, a lot of problematic assumptions. And arguing that something is natural can justify what is a very unjust moral order, economic order, some social problems can be justified, right? And just poor choices for our society or for the environment itself, right? And what does it disguise? Economic systems, economic inequality, right? We have a lot of it in market-based countries. The U.S. Has one of the greatest amounts of economic inequality out of any of the market democracies. A lot of social inequality, the social hierarchies, the power, all the things we talk about. Right? A nice quote explaining all of that right here. I'll let you read through that. One thing that comes up is that modern history is problematically viewed as a progression from primitivism to civilization, which of course, which is where all these binaries that stereotype and delegitimize people come from, right? But at some point, we want to do this as well. This, of course, is not just about memorizing ideas. It's about you as well. So ask yourself, what would happen if you did some of the following things? I bet you would get some strange looks from your family. The following things might look like a backward step in your life. To be civilized, what do you need? Do you need a bigger house? So if you said, hey, mom and dad, hey, friends, I think now that I graduated from college, I'm just going to get a small house, maybe even a smaller house than I could afford. I just don't think I want to make that big of a footprint. I bet a lot of your friends would feel that was kind of weird. They might think that that is noble as well. It would depend on the friend. But what I'm getting at is that all of these things look like downgrades. They look like we're not as successful in some way. They're signs of not being successful, which is not true at all. But if you got a smaller house or a smaller car or taking a job for less money so that you have more free time, perhaps, right? Not going on a long distance trip because of the economic impact, or maybe not having a wedding on an island somewhere and all 400 of your closest friends are all going to fly there as well, or something like this. So having a small wedding to avoid major expenses, having a lower economic impact. Again, maybe not inviting people from afar because they all have to fly there. There's many other things we could add to this, but these would all be seen as like antisocial signs, signs that you're not doing well, signs that you're not as successful as you actually are or could be, right? And so we can see that these look like a decline into, we don't want to call it primitivism, but that's kind of what we're working on. That's the binary. To be civilized and to be successful, we need the best versions of all of these things, right? So you can see how this applies to our everyday life. On page 13, we get a nice critique of past course ideas. Yay, that's good. We want to be doing that. We want our ideas to overlap and challenge each other. So we get sort of a stance on, basically this would be the Roosevelt essay that we read in Module 1. Conservation and preservation created a binary of cities as polluted, crime-ridden, immoral, and even though the reading doesn't say this, if the cities are where all the immoral, polluted things happen, that's not good for all the immigrants that are arriving at this time in U.S. history. They then also are polluted. They're the reasons for the crime and the immorality. And so all these stereotypes of the city fall in them as well. And so we can also think of the poem London doing something similar, right? The city is a place that is unnatural and has all of these immoral problems. And we can see we're dividing things by class as well as by ethnicity. Middle class tourists, as we learned in Module 1, were going out into the countryside. They could afford to leave the city. They could buy a train ticket out for the weekend or for a vacation. The poor, the recently arrived immigrants cannot. So we're already starting to see how the poor cannot avoid toxic environments like the city of the 1890s, 1910s, whatever it might be, right? So there's some history behind all this, and it's still going on now, of course. It also points out that biocentric positions can be hostile to environmental movements. So if you value nature above everything else, you might not even look at how certain marginalized people, say African American communities, keep getting a lot of toxic chemicals and nuclear waste dumped in their communities, their backyards, metaphorically speaking, right? So these environmentalists seem to be almost anti-humanists at that point, in that they're not worried about people's concerns or human health or happiness, but just the environment. And so we want to see that problem inside of here, right? So this reading is good at pointing out those problems. In the end, then, what does this teach us? Narratives, this is the point of our course, equal the language and power of language to control our views of the world, right? We see some things better and ignore their possibilities depending on the language provided. Ourselves a bit. We could just look at where chapter 1 opens up. This is the first chapter of the book. What are the political effects of calling something natural? That's what this is all about. It's good for people that work with the environment. It's good for scientists, for policymakers, as this comes up. Everybody should know this. Unfortunately, very few people do. You will know it, and you'll have to know what to do with your superpower, right, now that you know all this stuff. Here's some examples that you might not think of, but these involve the natural and maybe your discipline as well, depending what major you are, right? So cloning, stem cell research, genetically modified foods, biotechnologies. It's hard to determine what natural is. So the big takeaway on page 18, arguments from nature have long been used to try to justify social phenomena, and that would be dominant perspectives that people are trying to force on the world. These could be racial and cultural differences, various abilities of different groups to maybe succeed educationally, certain claims to how smart a group is, that is their cognitive abilities. Also cultural issues, the rightness and wrongness of gay relationships, right? It's often argued that homosexual relations are unnatural, yet there's plenty of instances of it out in the biosphere, right, and in the animal world. So it's more of a cultural rightness or wrongness, but it's argued that it is unnatural from nature, but it probably comes more from culture and religious culture at that, right? But what does this all mean, and what should you know? Arguing that something is natural is a powerful tactic to win an argument. Both sides often do it. If we want to break things into sort of conservatives versus progressives, even though that's not a good way to see the world, because we know that environmentalists might be arguing over with other environmental groups what is natural, right? And why? Well, alternative viewpoints become unnatural, right? It's real easy binary, and as humans, we're very susceptible to binary thinking. And this course is meant to bust you out of that. So consider GMOs, that are genetically modified organisms. We can just say food. GMOs would say, okay, I've got some, let's say some corn that's genetically modified, but it's still corn, and we tampered with the genes a bit, now it's going to grow better, and the seeds will be more reproductive, and they won't fail as often. But it's still corn, right? And in fact, it's a heightened version of what corn already was, but it's still natural. It hasn't changed. It's still corn. The other side would say, no, natural corn is what we had before we genetically modified it. Once you change the genes, it is no longer natural, but something else. But both sides would use that it is nature, and they would pick out the elements of nature that exist in their product and say, our product has these elements, these criteria of the natural, and they would argue from there. So everybody uses this, right? And so you should look for that out in the world, and one day you'll probably use it yourself, no doubt. And maybe in college and certainly after, right? We get some nifty examples. How should we feel about natural selection in a world where we tamper with environments, we change genes, we prolong some forms of cellular life, or they only live in a lab, right? You've got that interesting example of the tomato and the salmon on page 19. All right, so I know you've read the chapter, so maybe I'll just kind of go through some extra examples that I have here that go beyond the chapter. Using arguments from nature as a tool of power, that's what this is all about, right? How does power operate in our society? So here's some basic binaries that the book brings up that probably relate to what you do, regardless of what your major is, right? We can think of nature and nurture here is a good one. There people argue that it's got to be one or the other, but usually if we think of human behaviors, or we think of the way that genes express themselves, there's something of the potential embedded in the nature, embedded in the genetic code or the human being, but then the way that whatever it is, plant, animal, or human life is nurtured, lets those genes or behaviors express, they become rehearsed, and then they appear more often, right? And that's what we call life, I suppose. Here's some good examples that I thought I would walk you through that are away from the book in some ways, but these break down some of these divides. So type 1 diabetes. My wife is a type 1 diabetic, and that means that both of my boys have a 60% chance of becoming type 1 diabetic. It all depends upon essentially their environment, their nutrients, what we feed them, how much sugar we give them, and the types of healthy foods that they eat. So we're very careful with that around the house, as you can imagine. But it's part nature. They have it from the genes from their mother, from my wife. But it's how we raise them, right? And so there's a chance that neither one of them will become type 1 diabetic if we do everything we can in terms of food consumption and lifestyle, in terms of nurturance, right? So it's both. That binary is not true in this case. The mental emotional, again, I know this from what my wife does for a living. Anxiety and depression can be found in the genetic code. Some people are have a higher disposition to these. However, there's really interesting research showing that foods that lead to inflammation, usually that's foods based in wheat, so a lot of bread, even things like beer can lead to inflammation, right? And that inflammation can increase your depression. There's been a lot of research on that in a couple of years. So changing what the foods you eat can actually enhance or decrease your chances of depression. As can your family environment. That brings us all the way back to nurturance, right? The type of emotional situations going on in your family. We could look at cultural things as well. Marriage equality. Both sides argued that in some way either heterosexual behavior is somehow the natural way of things, or the other side argued that homosexuality, there's plenty of instances of it in nature, and there is some evidence that humans are hardwired for this. Some humans are, and so that is also an argument from nature based upon scientific evidence. Another one that's really interesting to me is the anti-vax movement, and that is that the human body has nature and that it doesn't need all these extra medications put into it. But that is probably not true. In many ways, we can nurture some of the things that our bodies don't naturally have, and then we won't have outbreaks and problems, right? But the anti-vax movement used the argument from nature as well. Our bodies are dispositioned to not need these things, and putting in foreign medicines can actually be bad. So the anti-vax movement, which was to not vaccinate your children, argued from nature as well, oftentimes. So we have a lot of other things. You can go through the notes. Let me take a break for a minute and see what else we want to cover specifically here in our final 2 minutes. The book covers how the U.S. was based in natural rights as breaking away from the English monarchy, which was based in divine rights. So we have a big belief in this system. It's pretty prominent in the rhetoric and the political thinking of the United States. But of course, as the book points out, not everyone got those rights in political equality. And we can look at when women finally got a vote and when the Voting Rights Act went through in the 60s to protect mainly African American voters. Clearly, not everyone got the right to vote. Only landowners did, right, if you know U.S. history, back when we established the natural rights of men or humans. A few other ideas. Big picture here, what is this all about? Well, if we label something natural, what does it do? It can actually get in the way. It might help you in your argument, but when it comes to society's thinking and trying to solve their problems, labeling something as natural too quickly, or even bothering with the natural argument, may lead to not solving our problems, but actually delay solutions. Big picture, we can't return to the natural. We can't go back there. We've only got the society that we're given now with the problems we're given now in the mix of humans in the environment, and we need to solve our problems based upon what we have. And arguing that something is more or less natural probably won't help us, because we're trying to return to origins, and we can't get back to origins. There's no returning in the world of, say, biotechnologies or climate change or environmental problems. We've got to deal with what we have now and look for solutions in the future. Enjoyed and learned from the ad analysis. Very, very fascinating ways to use these ideas, and very similar to what I want you to do when you're reading the literature in the future. That's why I included this chapter, because analyzing the ads isn't really any different than you'll analyze future texts in this second module. How we define some people as natural, how women blend into the landscape, yet men have dominion over it. The inherent problems of linking women with nature and letting other social actors stand by the wayside here I have a list of the big takeaways from the chapter. Thank you.